My name is Dylan Albeck, and today we are going to be talking about how plants reproduce, alternation of generations, and tracheophytes, bryophytes, and also how our ferns grew, what we did best, and what went wrong. We're going to be talking about how plants reproduce. There are many ways that this happens, but the first way that we're going to talk about is pollination. So pollination basically is sperm from a flower or plant. And it's mostly spread by insects, wind, and animals. So basically, an insect or animal, mostly, like for instance, a bee. The bee will land on the plant, get pollen on it, and it will carry it to another plant, and that fertilizes the other plant. But plants will also make themselves look as they are other insects, so that the bees will land. And this is called a sneaky flower. And they basically do this so that they will spread their pollen to other plants. Another way that plants reproduce is through seeds. And basically, the trees, plants, any type of thing, they have seeds or spores. And the seeds, they'll make into fruit a lot of times. And the fruits will hold seeds, and animals will eat the fruit, or the fruit will drop off the tree, and it will be spread by animals or by wind pushing them along, and then it will be fertilized and then grow and to be whatever type of fruit tree that was, or vegetable or anything of that sort. Another sort of reproduction that happens with plants is asexual reproduction, but this is 90% of the time this is a last option thing because it messes up the genetics of the plant, and it could end up making them fertile, and there will not be any more plants if all the plants become fertile from asexual reproduction. It also creates diversity. The next thing I'm going to talk about is perfect and imperfect plants. And what a perfect plant is basically the male and female parts are on the plant. And what an imperfect plant is it's two separate plants that create the male and female parts. To show you, this is a perfect plant. It has male and female parts on it, and I'm going to show you right here. This is the male reproductive organ. These yellow things all across the plant, and this top part is called the anther. The long part is called the filament, and together they're called a stamen. That's the male reproductive part of the plant. That's where the seeds are and the sperm for the plant. This middle green part, the big circle and the long green thing up the middle, are the female organs of the plant. The very tip of the green is the stigma. The long green part is the style. The middle green part is called the ovary, and they together are all called the carpel. Now, to start talking about alternation of generations, I'm going to talk about the life cycle. And basically, alternation generation is the life cycle of a plant. And it's pretty simple. They start out as gametophytes, egg, sperm. They get fertilized, turn into a zygote, and then they go through a whole cycle of growing, becoming an adult, and then they themselves release spores or seeds, and the whole cycle starts over again. To show you a more in-depth version, this is one for vascular plants or tracheophytes. So it's basically the same thing as I showed you before. It's just a little more advanced. And also vascular plants need lots of water for reproduction because they use the oxygen from the water for reproduction, and the sperm and egg swim through the water to meet each other for reproduction. So I had mentioned tracheophytes before, and I'd also like to talk about bryophytes and tracheophytes and how they're different. So tracheophytes are vascular plants such as ferns, like I had mentioned before. These need lots of water, lots of oxygen to survive. While bryophytes, on the other hand, are non-vascular plants that do not need lots of oxygen to survive. These are things such as mosses, liverworts, things like that do not need lots of oxygen to survive.
We're going to be discussing the reproduction process in tracheophytes, and I made a diagram so you can follow along. So tracheophytes are divided into two groups by whether or not they reproduce with seeds, and I drew that on this diagram. Alright, so we have our seedless tracheophytes or our seeded tracheophytes, and I'm going to start with explaining the seeded tracheophytes. So we have two different groups for the seeded. The first one is angiosperms, and those produce flowers, and they also produce fruit with enclosed seeds, and I drew a picture of a flower down there with seeds in the middle. The petals protect the seeds. Alright, and then we have gymnosperms. They have exposed seeds, and pine cones are an example of that, like on pine trees. Alright, and then let's move to our seedless. An example of the seedless tracheophytes are ferns, and ferns use spores in order to reproduce, which are tiny, almost like a powder. They're very small. And this is just like a close-up picture of what spores would look like, or what they do look like. So they're round, and they're on the tips of the leaves, like so. Like I said, the tracheophytes are vascular, and you can see that with the lines.
Ferns are an example of a tracheophyte, and they're a really good example because they are not as evolved as other tracheophytes, and they actually have spores instead of seeds. And here's a list of the differences, but basically seeds don't need water, and they can live anywhere. They're protected by the seed coat until they start to grow, and they can be dispersed in different ways. And they're also a lot larger than a spore. And then spores need water. They need a lot of water, and they have to be near water to grow. They have no protection from any of the harsh conditions, and they have to grow where they land. And they're really a lot smaller than a seed.
Now we're going to talk about how to grow a fern properly. So I drew another diagram. The fern, a seedless vascular plant, like we already discussed earlier. So our project was to grow ferns from spores. Alright, so I made the little steps down here. So it starts with the spores in a agar plate in a petri dish. Alright, so you need that. And then you need to add water because they really like moist environments. And then we add, after a while, showing up here actually, after it grows a little bit, we're going to transplant it into a jar with soil. And I actually have an example of that right here. So, put that down. This is a fern inside of a jar, and I usually have the lid on it just because they grow pretty well when it's just really moist, and since we are in Pueblo West, it's kind of a prairie, it gets pretty dry, so that's pretty necessary. But yeah, here's a good example of that. Another thing that they like is a lot of shade. And supposedly female ferns can grow in more sunlight than the male ferns. But again, with our cycle, so it is in the jar. We put the agar and the spores into a jar, and then growth gets a little bit bigger. Now you can put it outside as long as it still has those conditions like the moisture and indirect sunlight, and it'll keep growing. When the ferns are mature enough, when they are adult ferns, they produce spores, like we talked about earlier. There they are, and then the cycle starts over.
A couple of the ferns didn't grow, and that was simply just because ferns need a lot of water to be able to prosper and grow, and they love humidity, and the warmer the room is, the better that they are able to grow. And the plants that we had that didn't grow, we really underwatered. We needed to water them way more than what we did. And they also were not really in a humid environment at all. And for me personally, the room I kept my fern in was really cold, and it wasn't warm enough to really even have humidity in it. But if the plants did have those conditions, they would have grown a lot more than they did.